Vince Neil. On the evening of December 8, 1984, Hanoi Rocks drummer Nicholas Dingley, known to the rock world as Razzle, was riding shotgun in a De Tomaso Pantera through the streets of Redondo Beach, California. He had a handful of liquor bottles balanced in his lap because the car had no back seat. The driver was Motley Crue frontman Vince Neil. They were on a beer run, heading out from a party that had already been going for days. It was supposed to take 15 minutes. Razzle never made it back. Neil was 23 years old and at the peak of Motley Crue's early fame. The band's Shout at the Devil tour had made them one of the biggest acts in American rock. Razzle, 24, had come to Los Angeles with Hanoi Rocks, a Finnish glam band that was building real momentum across Europe and starting to break into the American market. They were on the verge. Industry people were paying attention. Labels were circling. The trip to LA was supposed to be a career milestone, not a funeral. Razzle and Neil had been drinking together for hours at Neil's Redondo Beach home before deciding they needed more alcohol. That decision, made casually and without a second thought, would end one career permanently and barely interrupt another. Neil's blood alcohol level was later measured at 0.17, nearly double California's legal limit of 0.10 at the time. Police determined he was driving 65 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone on a rain-slicked road. According to Neil's own account, he swerved to avoid a parked fire truck, lost control, and collided head-on with an oncoming vehicle. Razzle suffered catastrophic head injuries on impact. He was pronounced gone at South Bay Hospital at 7:19 that evening. The two occupants of the other car survived, but both sustained severe brain damage that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Neil was arrested at the scene on suspicion of drunk driving and vehicular manslaughter, brought to the Torrance Police Department, and released on just $2,500 bail. And somehow, it gets worse. In September of 1985, Los Angeles County Superior Court Judge Edward M. Hins Jr. accepted Neil's guilty plea and handed down a sentence that stunned almost everyone paying attention. 30 days in county jail, 5 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, $2.6 million in restitution to the surviving victims, and a requirement to give anti-drunk driving talks at schools. Neil served 19 days of that 30-day sentence. He was credited for good behavior. He later told an interviewer that he absolutely deserved to go to prison, but that he did 30 days in jail where he drank beer, and that money had made the difference. He said it plainly, without remorse, as though describing an inconvenience he had bought his way out of. The $2.6 million in restitution went to the victims in the other car, a couple who had done nothing wrong and whose lives were permanently altered by someone else's decision to drive at 65 miles per hour, while nearly twice the legal limit. Motley Crue dedicated their 1985 album, Theater of Pain, to Razzle. The band kept touring. The album went platinum. For the families destroyed on that wet road in Redondo Beach, there was no dedication and no platinum record. There was brain damage and a restitution check. That would have been a grim enough story on its own. But Neil's pattern behind the wheel did not stop in 1984. In 2007, he was pulled over in Las Vegas on suspicion of drunk driving and pleaded down to reckless driving. Then on June 27, 2010, Las Vegas police stopped him again, this time driving his Lamborghini at 60 miles per hour in a 45 zone, weaving between lanes. He blew .215 and .216 on 2 separate breathalyzer tests, nearly 3 times the legal limit. He pleaded guilty the following January to misdemeanor DUI and was sentenced to 15 days in Clark County Detention Center. He served 10. He was also ordered to pay a $500 donation to Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Razzle's bandmates in Hanoi Rocks never recovered. The group disbanded shortly after his passing, and while they briefly reunited decades later, the momentum they had been building in 1984 was gone permanently. Neil was also arrested for misdemeanor battery in 2011 and again in 2016. The second time after allegedly dragging a woman by her hair at a Las Vegas casino. None of it slowed him down. As of 2026, Vince Neil is 65 years old and still touring with Motley Crue. Razzle was 24 when he lost his life in that passenger seat. His family received a share of the $2.6 million restitution. The two people in the other car, the ones who survived with permanent brain injuries, have never spoken publicly about what that night cost them. The leniency Neil received, 19 days for taking a life, is still cited in legal discussions about celebrity accountability. And no, I am not making that up. 19 days, then back on stage. Neil's case sits at one end of a spectrum. A famous face, a fatal decision, a sentence that barely registered as punishment. The next case on this list sits at the opposite end, where the sentence matched the gravity of what happened, but nothing about the crime itself made any sense. Ryan Grantham. On the night of April 1st, 2020, a young man walked into a Vancouver Police Department building in East Vancouver and told the officers at the front desk that he had taken the life of his mother. He was calm, he was direct, and he had driven hours to get there, after spending the previous day and a half considering far worse acts of violence that he ultimately could not bring himself to carry out. His name was Ryan Grantham, and most people who recognized him knew him as a child actor from Diary of a Wimpy Kid in Riverdale. How does someone go from appearing on a hit television series to confessing to something like that? Grantham, born in 1998, had grown up in Squamish, British Columbia, a small mountain town about an hour north of Vancouver. He landed his first notable role as Rodney James in the 2010 film Diary of a Wimpy Kid, and years later appeared as Jeffrey Augustine in a recurring role on Riverdale. For a while, things seemed to be on a normal trajectory. He was a working actor with recognizable credits, a university enrollment, and a family in a quiet town. But by 2020, his acting career had stalled. He was enrolled at Simon Fraser University, but according to psychiatric evaluations presented during his sentencing, he had been struggling with untreated major depressive disorder and heavy cannabis use for months. He had withdrawn from almost everyone around him. The COVID-19 lockdown, which had just begun in British Columbia, deepened that isolation into something far more dangerous. On March 31st, 2020, inside the family home in Squamish, Grantham's mother, Barbara Waite, was playing the piano. She was 64 years old. Grantham came up behind her with a .22 caliber rifle and shot her in the back of the head. She died where she sat. Immediately afterward, Grantham set up a GoPro camera, recorded a video in which he confessed to what he had done, and showed the camera what was behind him. The next day, he covered her body with a sheet, arranged lit candles around it, and hung a rosary from the piano. Everything was in place for what came next. Grantham just did not know what he was building toward. He loaded his car with 3 firearms, ammunition, Molotov cocktails, camping supplies, and a map. The destination marked on that map was Rideau Cottage in Ottawa, the official residence of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He began driving east on the Trans-Canada Highway, away from Squamish, away from his mother's body, and toward a plan that, if carried out, would have been one of the most devastating acts of targeted violence in Canadian history. He made it as far as Hope, British Columbia, roughly 150 kilometers from Squamish. And then he stopped. He turned the car around. Court documents later revealed that during that drive, he also considered carrying out a mass shooting at Simon Fraser University or on the Lionsgate Bridge, one of Vancouver's most heavily trafficked structures. He went through with none of it. The distance between what Grantham planned and what Grantham did is the central tension of this entire case. Instead of continuing east, he drove to Vancouver and surrendered. Grantham pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in March of 2022. The sentencing hearing that followed laid bare the full scope of what he had planned and what he had chosen not to do. The Crown pushed for parole ineligibility of 17 to 18 years, arguing the premeditation and the scope of the intended violence warranted a longer period. The defense asked for 12, citing Grantham's mental state, his age, and the fact that he had voluntarily surrendered. Defense psychiatrists testified that Grantham had told them he took his mother's life so she would not have to witness whatever he was planning to do next. He framed it in his own mind as an act of mercy. British Columbia Supreme Court Justice Kathleen Kerr rejected that framing, but acknowledged the complexity of the case. She called it tragic and heartbreaking, and noted that Grantham's decision not to follow through on the mass violence plans was, in her words, a saving grace. She also weighed the GoPro confession, the loaded car, and the map to the Prime Minister's residence as evidence that this was not an impulsive act, but a deliberated one that happened to stop before it escalated further. On September 21st, 2022, Justice Kerr sentenced Grantham to the mandatory life in prison with parole ineligibility set at 14 years, along with a lifetime firearms ban. You would think someone would have noticed the warning signs earlier, the depression, the withdrawal, the escalating ideation. Nobody did. As of 2026, Ryan Grantham remains in a Correctional Service Canada federal institution. He will not be eligible to apply for parole until 2036, 14 years from the date of his sentencing. No appeals have altered that timeline. Barbara Waite, the woman playing piano in her own home on a quiet evening in Squamish, was 64 years old when her son ended her life. She has no public memorial and no advocacy group carrying her name. What remains of her story exists almost entirely in court transcripts and news coverage of the person who took her from the world. The calculation that a court makes when sentencing someone like Grantham, balancing mental illness against premeditation, future danger against demonstrated restraint, is one of the hardest exercises in criminal law. The same calculation played out very differently in the next case, where the evidence was overwhelming. The defendant was a legend, and it still took 2 trials to reach a verdict. Phil Spector. At around 5 in the morning on February 3, 2003, a chauffeur named Adriano D'Souza was sitting in a parked car outside a mansion in Alhambra, California, waiting for his client to come out. The mansion was known locally as the Pyrenees Castle. The client was Phil Spector, the music producer behind some of the most iconic recordings of the 1960s. When Spector finally appeared at the front door, he was holding a Colt Cobra .38 revolver. He told D'Souza that he thought he had taken someone's life. Inside the foyer, actress Lana Clarkson lay dead from a single gunshot wound through the mouth. She was 40 years old. Nobody was paying much attention to Lana Clarkson at that point in her career. She was best known for the 1985 B-movie Barbarian Queen and had been working as a VIP hostess at the House of Blues on the Sunset Strip, a job she had taken to make ends meet while trying to rebuild her acting career. Friends described her as optimistic despite the setbacks, someone who still believed her break was coming. That evening, she had met Spector at the club, and he had invited her back to his home for drinks. Clarkson reportedly tried to leave at some point during the early morning hours. What happened inside the Pyrenees Castle between roughly 2:30 and 5 in the morning remains a matter contested by the defense to this day. But the prosecution's theory was straightforward. Spector did not want her to go. Spector was charged with second-degree murder in November of 2003 and released on $1 million bail. His first trial began on March 19, 2007, before Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Larry Paul Fidler. The trial was televised by Court TV. The prosecution's case relied heavily on DeSouza's testimony and on the accounts of 5 separate women who testified that Spector had threatened them with firearms in strikingly similar situations over the years. The pattern they described was consistent. Spector would invite a woman to his home, drinks would be consumed, and when the woman attempted to leave, Spector would produce a gun. The defense, initially led by Bruce Cutler, argued that Clarkson had been depressed over her stalled acting career and a recent breakup, and that she had taken her own life by placing the revolver in her mouth. They pointed to what they characterized as emotional instability and a pattern of career disappointment. The prosecution countered with forensic evidence, including blood spatter patterns and the position of the weapon, and argued that the scenario the defense described was physically inconsistent with what investigators found at the scene. The clock was already ticking on the defense's argument, but the jury could not quite agree. On September 26, 2007, after weeks of deliberation, Judge Fidler declared a mistrial. The jury had voted 10-2 in favor of conviction but could not reach unanimity. The retrial opened on October 20, 2008, this time without television cameras. Prosecutors Alan Jackson and Truck Dew called Spector a very dangerous man, with a documented history of playing Russian roulette with the lives of women around him. New defense counsel Doran Weinberg continued the suicide theory, but the 5 prior incident witnesses testified again, and their accounts had not changed. The women described nearly identical scenarios spanning decades, each one involving alcohol, a late night at Spector's home, and a firearm produced when they tried to leave. The cumulative weight of that pattern was something the second jury could not ignore. On April 13, 2009, after approximately 30 hours of deliberation, the jury found Phil Spector guilty of second-degree murder and of the personal use of a firearm. On May 29, 2009, Judge Fidler sentenced him to 19 years to life in state prison, 15 to life for the taking of Lana Clarkson's life, plus 4 years for the firearm enhancement. Spector appealed. The California 2nd District Court of Appeal affirmed the conviction in May of 2011. The California Supreme Court declined review that August. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear the case. Spector would have become eligible for parole in 2024. He never made it. On January 16, 2021, Phil Spector passed away at the age of 81 inside the California healthcare facility in Stockton. The cause was complications from COVID-19, according to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. He maintained his innocence until the end. Lana Clarkson's family has consistently and publicly rejected the suicide narrative. The forensic evidence, the witness testimony, and the pattern of behavior all pointed in one direction. It took 6 years and 2 trials to get there, but the system ultimately reached a verdict. As of 2026, Phil Spector's conviction stands. Lana Clarkson's legacy, for those who choose to look beyond the circumstances of her passing, includes a career she was still fighting for on the night she walked into the Pyrenees Castle. She was 40 years old, working a hostess job and still showing up. The industry that forgot her name remembered Phil Spector's. Spector's case involved a crime scene, a weapon, and a chauffeur who heard a confession in real time. The evidence, while fiercely disputed, was at least tangible. The next case has almost none of that. What it has instead is a single gunshot, a room full of unreliable witnesses, and a story that the man who pulled the trigger changed multiple times over the course of his life. William S. Burroughs. William S. Burroughs once reflected that he never would have become a writer if not for the night he took the life of his common-law wife, Joan Vollmer. He said it haunted him, that it put him in contact with something dark inside himself, and that writing was the only way he found to survive it. Most people encounter that statement as a literary anecdote, something provocative a famous Beat Generation author once said in an interview. But it is not an anecdote. It is a description of what happened on the evening of September 6, 1951, in a small apartment above a bar in Mexico City. Joan Vollmer was 28 years old. She had graduated from Barnard College and was considered by scholars of the Beat Generation to be one of its intellectual foundations. The writer Brenda Knight, in her study Women of the Beat Generation, described Vollmer as seminal in the creation of the beat revolution, the person against whom the main beat writers sharpened their intellect. Her Manhattan apartment in the mid-1940s had served as a regular gathering place for Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and Burroughs himself. She was sharp, well-read, and by multiple accounts the person who challenged those writers to think harder and reach further. She was not a bystander in the movement. She was part of its foundation, even if history would spend the next 7 decades treating her as a footnote to the man who took her life. After her first marriage to Paul Adams ended, she became Burroughs's common-law wife in 1946. They had a son together the following year. By 1951, the couple had relocated to Mexico City to avoid drug charges in the United States. Both were deep into substance use. Burroughs was addicted to opiates and had been for years. Vollmer was consuming large quantities of Benzedrine. Their relationship had deteriorated badly. On the evening of September 6th, they were at the apartment of an American expatriate named John Healy, located above a place called the Bounty Bar. Also present were 2 other Americans, Edwin John Woods and Louis Marker. Their young son was in the room. Burroughs had brought a .380 Star automatic pistol that he intended to sell. What happened next depends on which version of the story you believe, because Burroughs told it differently almost every time. In his earliest statements to reporters and Mexican police, he said he proposed a William Tell Act. Vollmer placed a highball glass on top of her head. Burroughs aimed from across the room and fired. The bullet struck her in the forehead. She was rushed to Cruz Roja Hospital and pronounced dead. After consulting with his attorney, a man named Bernabe Jurado, Burroughs changed his account entirely. He claimed the gun had gone off accidentally while he was inspecting it before the sale, that it had discharged when he dropped it. This became the official defense. 2 witnesses were prepared to support that version in court, and ballistics experts were reportedly brought in to corroborate the accidental discharge theory. Multiple secondary sources, including biographer James Grauerholtz's detailed monograph on the incident, assert that bribes were paid to secure this cooperation. Grauerholtz himself concluded that the William Tell version was the most consistent with the physical evidence. Burroughs spent 13 days in a Mexican jail before his brother Mortimer reportedly arranged bail. When his attorney Jurado later fled Mexico after his own legal trouble, which involved shooting the son of a prominent Mexican official, Burroughs jumped bail and returned to the United States. He was convicted in absentia in 1953 of imprudentia criminal, the Mexican equivalent of culpable homicide or manslaughter, and received a 2-year suspended sentence. He never returned to Mexico. He never served a single day. Vollmer was buried at Panteon Americano in Mexico City. In 1990, a posted notice appeared at the cemetery calling for her family to pay overdue interment fees. That detail sits quietly next to the rest of this story, but it says something about how thoroughly Joan Vollmer was forgotten by the people closest to her. Burroughs went on to publish Junkie in 1953, then Naked Lunch in 1959, and spent the next 4 decades as one of the most celebrated experimental writers in American literature. He was inducted into the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters. He collaborated with artists, musicians, and filmmakers. He became a counterculture icon. And through all of it, the fact that he had taken a woman's life and walked free remained a biographical detail, not a defining one. The literary world treated it as tragic backstory, not as a crime that went unpunished. His son, William S. Burroughs Jr., never recovered from the family he was born into. He struggled with addiction his entire life and passed away from cirrhosis-related complications at the age of 33 in 1981. Burroughs himself passed away from heart attack complications on August 2, 1997, in Lawrence, Kansas. He was 83. He spent the decades between Joan Vollmer's passing and his own alternately acknowledging the William Tell story, denying it, reframing it, and crediting it as the event that made him who he was. The Mexican court gave him a suspended sentence for taking a life. American literary culture gave him a legacy. Joan Vollmer got an overdue burial notice and a footnote. As of 2026, the case remains exactly where Mexican authorities left it in 1953, closed, suspended, and unanswered. Sid Vicious. On the morning of October 12, 1978, the body of Nancy Spungen was found under the sink in the bathroom of room 100 at the Hotel Chelsea in Manhattan. She had bled out from a single stab wound to her lower abdomen, roughly 1 inch wide, that had ruptured the blood vessels lining her intestine. The weapon was a Jaguar K11 hunting knife that Spungen herself had purchased for her boyfriend just days earlier. Her boyfriend was Sid Vicious, the bassist for the Sex Pistols, and he was still in the room when police arrived. What nobody knew at the time, and what has never been resolved since, is whether he was the one who used that knife. 3 years before that morning at the Chelsea, Sid Vicious, born John Simon Ritchie, was a fixture in the London punk scene but barely a musician. He had been brought into the Sex Pistols in 1977, more for his image than his ability. He could barely play bass. What he could do was embody the chaos that punk demanded. Nancy Spungen, an American from Philadelphia, had followed the band to London and attached herself to Vicious almost immediately. By the time the Sex Pistols imploded in January of 1978 after their disastrous American tour, Vicious and Spungen were inseparable. Mutually addicted to heroin and spiraling together through a lifestyle that everyone around them could see was heading somewhere dark, they checked into the Hotel Chelsea in the fall of 1978. The Chelsea was already infamous, a crumbling residential hotel on West 23rd Street that had housed writers, artists, and drifters for decades. Room 100 became a revolving door of drug dealers, hangers-on, and fellow addicts. Vicious and Spungen were both deep into heroin at this point, and neither was functioning in any meaningful sense. Spungen had a reputation for volatility. Vicious had a reputation for violence, most of it directed at himself. The relationship between them was chaotic and codependent, held together by drugs and the absence of anyone willing to intervene. On the night of October 11th, multiple visitors came and went from the room. According to later accounts compiled in Cheryl Tippin's History of the Chelsea Hotel, several of those visitors saw Vicious take as many as 30 Tuanal tablets over the course of the evening, a dose of the barbiturate large enough to render almost anyone unconscious for hours. 2 people who visited the room later said Spungen was still alive at around 5 in the morning. By the time hotel staff responded to a disturbance later that morning, she was gone. Vicious was arrested that afternoon. In his initial statements to police and the district attorney, he reportedly said that he had stabbed her, but never meant to end her life, that he loved her, but she treated him badly. Minutes later, he said he had no memory of the events at all. Then he suggested she might have fallen on the knife. The NYPD charged him with second-degree homicide. Bail was set at $50,000, paid by Virgin Records. His legal team initially included attorneys from F. Lee Bailey's firm. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Releasing Vicious on bail set in motion a chain of events that would ensure the case was never resolved. In December of 1978, Vicious attacked Patti Smith's brother Todd with a broken bottle at the club Hurrah and was sent to Rikers Island, where he was forced to detox from heroin cold turkey. He was released on bail again on February 1st, 1979. That night, at a small gathering in the Greenwich Village apartment of his new girlfriend Michelle Robinson, Vicious used heroin reportedly supplied by his own mother, Ann Beverly, who was herself a registered addict. He was found unresponsive the following morning. The autopsy confirmed opioid overdose as the cause. He was 21. The case against him effectively closed. No trial, no verdict, no cross-examination of any witness. The NYPD considered it solved. Many people close to the situation did not. Sex Pistols manager Malcolm McLaren maintained that Vicious was physically incapable of having done it, pointing to the massive barbiturate dose and suggesting the real cause was a robbery gone wrong. Cash had reportedly gone missing from the room. Author Phil Strongman, in his History of Punk, accused a drug dealer and stand-up comedian named Rockets Red Glare, who had delivered Dilaudid to the room earlier that night and who reportedly confessed privately to friends before his own passing in 2001. Vicious's mother, before her own overdose in 1996, claimed her son and Spungen had entered into a pact to end their lives together. None of these theories have ever been tested in a courtroom. As of 2026, the case of Nancy Spungen's passing remains formally closed by the NYPD, but legally unresolved. Sid Vicious was never convicted. No alternative suspect was ever charged. The only physical evidence, the knife, was purchased by the victim herself. And the only person ever accused was unconscious on enough barbiturates to flatten a horse for most of the night in question. That is not a typo, by the way. 30 Tuinal tablets. The Spungen case is one where the accused never faced a jury. The next case is one where the accused stood trial, walked into court insisting it was an accident, and then made the situation immeasurably worse by trying to cover it up. If you like this video and have not subscribed yet, now is a great time to join. We post a new case every day, so hit subscribe and do not miss what is coming next. Jason Williams. On the night of February 14, 2002, roughly a dozen guests were inside the 30,000-square-foot mansion of former New Jersey Nets all-star Jason Williams in Alexandria Township, New Jersey. Williams had just hosted members of his NBA charity basketball team at a Harlem Globetrotters game in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and had hired a limousine to bring everyone back to his estate for the evening. The driver of that limousine was a 55-year-old man named Kostas Christofi, who went by Gus. That was February 14th. By the early hours of February 15th, Gus Christofi would be gone, and Jason Williams would be standing in his bedroom trying to stage the scene to look like something it was not. Williams was 33 years old. His NBA career had ended prematurely in 1999 due to a broken leg, but he had been an all-star, a fan favorite, and a wealthy man living in one of the largest private homes in New Jersey. He had earned tens of millions of dollars over his career and had used a significant portion of it to build an estate that was as much a showpiece as a residence. He was known for giving tours of the property to guests, and on this particular night, that tour included his bedroom, where he kept a collection of firearms on display. Among them was a double-barreled 12-gauge shotgun. Williams picked it up to show the room. He snapped the barrels shut without checking the safety or inspecting both chambers. The weapon discharged directly into Kostas Christofi's chest. Christofi was standing just feet away. He died on the spot. If Williams had stopped there, this would be a very different story. What happened next turned a potential manslaughter charge into something far more damaging. Prosecution witnesses testified that immediately after the shooting, Williams attempted to stage the scene as a suicide. He placed the shotgun in Christofi's hands. He wiped his own fingerprints from the weapon. He stripped naked, jumped into his pool to wash off any gunshot residue, and then told the other guests in the room to lie to police about what had happened. A man was dead on his bedroom floor, and Williams's first instinct was not to call for help. It was to build a story. Williams was charged with aggravated manslaughter, reckless manslaughter, aggravated assault, possession of a weapon for unlawful purpose, and 4 separate counts related to the cover-up, including tampering with witnesses, fabricating evidence, and hindering his own apprehension. The case drew national attention not just because of Williams's fame, but because the cover-up was so brazen that it became the prosecution's strongest evidence. Multiple guests who had been in the bedroom testified to what they saw Williams do in the minutes after the shooting. The trial took place in 2004 in Somerset County, New Jersey, after the venue was moved from Hunterdon County. The jury acquitted Williams of aggravated manslaughter, aggravated assault, and the weapons charge, but convicted him on all 4 cover-up counts. They deadlocked on the reckless manslaughter charge, so he walked out of that courtroom convicted of lying about a man's passing, but not yet held accountable for causing it. In January of 2003, before the criminal trial even began, Williams settled the wrongful death civil suit brought by Christophe's family for $2.75 million following mediation. The criminal reckless manslaughter charge, still unresolved, hung over him for years while pre-trial motions and procedural delays pushed the retrial further and further out. In early January 2010, Williams was arrested again, this time for driving while intoxicated after crashing his SUV into a tree in Manhattan with a blood alcohol level reportedly more than double the legal limit. The DWI arrest seemed to accelerate the legal process. Days later, on January 11, 2010, Williams appeared before New Jersey Superior Court Judge Edward M. Coleman and pleaded guilty to an amended charge of aggravated assault by recklessly causing bodily injury with a deadly weapon. The original charge had been reckless manslaughter. The plea reduced it. In other words, 8 years after Costas Christofi was shot in a bedroom in New Jersey, and 6 years after the first trial, Williams finally admitted in a courtroom that his recklessness caused the death of Gus Christofi. On February 23, 2010, Judge Coleman sentenced Williams to 5 years in state prison with 18 months of parole ineligibility under New Jersey's Graves Act, to run concurrently with his cover-up sentences. Williams served 18 months in a New Jersey state facility, was transferred to Rikers Island in April of 2011 for 8 additional months on the New York DWI conviction, and was released on April 13, 2012. As of 2026, Jason Williams is 58 years old and has remained out of custody. He published memoirs in 2012 and 2018 and has spoken publicly about his time in prison. Costas Christofi was 55 when he was taken from his family. He had done nothing that night except his job. Williams hired a car, took a life, covered it up, and served 18 months. The next case goes back even further, to 1936, and involves a man so powerful that the word accountability did not seem to apply to him at all. Howard Hughes. There is a version of this story that has circulated online for years, claiming that Howard Hughes struck and took the life of an Austrian singer named Greta Keller in a car accident in 1936. That version is wrong. Keller was a cabaret performer who did not even emigrate to the United States until 1938 and had no connection to the accident whatsoever. The real victim was a man named Gabriel Samuel Meyer, a 59-year-old furniture salesman who worked at the May department store in downtown Los Angeles. He lived on South Lucerne Avenue. He has been largely erased from the popular retelling of this story, so consider this a correction. Hughes's habit of avoiding consequences for the damage he caused was already well established by 1936. On the night of Saturday, July 11th of that year, the 30-year-old aviator and film producer was driving a 1929 Duesenberg through the intersection of 3rd Street and Lorraine Boulevard in the Hancock Park area of Los Angeles. His passenger was a Pasadena socialite named Nancy Bell Bailey. The two had spent the evening drinking cocktails, first at Trader Vic's and then at the Coconut Grove. Heavy fog had set in across the neighborhood, and the street light at the intersection where the accident occurred was burned out. Hughes struck Gabriel Meyer, who had been waiting in the safety zone of a streetcar stop. A person standing in a designated safe area, doing nothing but waiting for a ride home. Meyer was 59 years old, born on November 27th of 1876, and had spent his working life in retail. He was not a public figure. He had no connection to Hollywood. No reason to be part of this story except that he happened to be standing in the wrong place when a wealthy man driving a powerful car came through the fog. Meyer was rushed to a hospital, but did not survive. Hughes was taken to a separate hospital, where he was certified sober on an official test, though an attending doctor reportedly noted that he had been drinking. He was booked on suspicion of negligent homicide. His attorney, Neil S. McCarthy, obtained a writ of habeas corpus the following morning, and Hughes was released. A witness initially told police that Hughes had been driving erratically and too fast, and that Meyer had been standing inside the safety zone when he was struck. In less than a week, the same detail that should have anchored the prosecution's case simply changed. By the time the coroner's inquest convened on July 15th and 16th of 1936, that same witness had altered his testimony to say that Meyer had stepped out in front of the Duesenberg. The difference between those two versions is the difference between negligent homicide and an unavoidable accident. One version puts Hughes at fault. The other absolves him entirely. And somehow, between the initial police report and the inquest, the version that absolved the millionaire became the official record. Secondary sources, including the book Family Secret, allege that a Hughes associate bribed the witness, though that claim cannot be independently confirmed from primary court documents. Nancy Bailey corroborated Hughes's version of events. On July 16th, the coroner's jury ruled the death an unavoidable accident. The district attorney recommended Hughes be cleared. No criminal charges were ever filed. Hughes told reporters outside the inquest that he had been driving slowly and that a man stepped out of the darkness in front of him. A reported financial settlement with the Meyer family, estimated at roughly $215,000 in modern terms, appears in one secondary source, but has never been corroborated by publicly accessible court or estate records. So even the question of whether the family received anything remains unverified. Hughes went on to survive 4 serious airplane crashes over the next decade, including the near-fatal July 7th, 1946 crash of the experimental XF-11 reconnaissance plane into homes in Beverly Hills. That crash left him with severe burns, multiple fractures, and a chronic pain condition that drove his dependence on opioids for the rest of his life. He became a recluse, a billionaire who spent his final years isolated in hotel penthouses, surrounded by aides, consuming codeine and Valium, and trusting almost no one. He passed away on April 5th, 1976, aboard a chartered jet en route from Acapulco to Houston at the age of 70. His estate was worth an estimated $2.5 billion. The family of the furniture salesman he struck in 1936 may or may not have received a settlement. No public record confirms it either way. As of 2026, Gabriel Meyer's grave sits at Home of Peace Memorial Park in East Los Angeles. The commonly repeated version of this story still names the wrong victim. Meyer was a furniture salesman waiting for a streetcar. Hughes was one of the richest men alive. The coroner's jury said it was unavoidable. The record suggests otherwise. Hughes had the resources to reshape the facts around a fatal accident before charges could even be filed. The final case on this list involves a defendant who did not have that kind of power, but the outcome was nearly as frustrating. A jury acquitted him, a civil court held him liable, and the victim's case remains officially unsolved. Robert Blake. On the night of May 4, 2001, Robert Blake and his wife Bonny Lee Bakley had dinner at Vitello's Italian restaurant in Studio City, California. It was an unremarkable evening at an unremarkable neighborhood restaurant. When they finished, they walked about a block and a half to where Blake had parked his 1991 Dodge Stealth on a side street near a construction site. Blake told police that he helped Bakley into the passenger seat, then realized he had left his handgun, a Smith & Wesson, back at their table inside the restaurant. He said he walked back to retrieve it. When he returned to the car minutes later, Bakley had been shot twice with a Walther P-38. She was 44 years old. The weapon was recovered from a nearby dumpster. So why was Robert Blake, the Emmy-winning star of Beretta and the 1967 film In Cold Blood, eating dinner in Studio City with a woman he reportedly never wanted to marry in the first place? Bonny Lee Bakley had 9 prior marriages and a documented history of pursuing celebrity relationships through mail-order correspondence schemes. She had targeted Jerry Lee Lewis and Christian Brando, among others, and had built a small business around what investigators described as lonely hearts scams. She was, by most accounts, a woman with a complicated and sometimes illegal past, none of which justified what happened to her. After a paternity test confirmed Blake was the father of her daughter, born in June of 2000. Blake agreed to marry Bakley in November of that year, but only after securing a custody agreement. By all accounts, the marriage was strained from the start. Blake housed Bakley in a guest bungalow behind his main residence rather than in the home itself. He made no secret of the fact that the marriage was about custody, not affection. On April 18, 2002, nearly a year after the shooting, Lapt arrested Blake at his Los Feliz home. He was charged with 1 count of taking a life with the special circumstance of lying in wait, 1 count of conspiracy, and 2 counts of solicitation. The prosecution's theory was that Blake had tried to hire 2 former stuntmen to end Bakley's life before doing it himself. Co-defendant Earl Caldwell, Blake's bodyguard, was charged with conspiracy. Blake spent roughly a year in custody without bail before being released on $1.5 million bond to house arrest. For a man who had spent decades as a television star, the transition to an ankle monitor and a courtroom was total. The criminal trial ran from December of 2004 through March of 2005 in Los Angeles Superior Court before Judge Darlene Schempp, with Blake represented by M. Gerald Schwartzbach. The 2 stuntmen, Gary McClarty and Ronald Hamilton, testified that Blake had approached them about ending Bakley's life. Both were impeached on cross-examination over extensive histories of methamphetamine and cocaine use, and their credibility took significant damage. A key forensic dispute centered on 4 to 5 particles of gunshot residue found on Blake's hands. The defense brought in a test-firing expert who estimated that more than 100 particles would be expected if Blake had actually fired the Walther. Blake also tested negative for blood spatter. The conspiracy charge had been dismissed earlier in the proceedings. On March 16, 2005, the jury acquitted Blake of the primary charge and 1 count of solicitation, voting 11-1 for acquittal. They deadlocked 11-1 for acquittal on the 2nd solicitation count, and the judge subsequently dismissed it. Blake walked out of that courtroom a free man. The story did not end there. Bakley's adult children from prior relationships, including her daughter Holly Gowan, filed a wrongful death suit. In the civil trial, Blake took the stand, something he had not done in the criminal case. By his own attorney's assessment, he self-destructed. Where the criminal trial had been about careful forensic arguments and witness credibility, the civil trial became about Blake himself, his temperament, his statements, and his behavior on the stand. On November 18, 2005, a Burbank civil jury found Blake liable for intentionally causing Bakley's passing and ordered him to pay $30 million. A California court of appeal later reduced the award to roughly $15 million, and the parties eventually reached a confidential settlement. The judgment drove Blake into bankruptcy. He spent his final years living on Social Security and a Screen Actors Guild pension, a long fall from the man who had once starred in one of the defining crime films of the 20th century. In 5 words, here is the legal distinction that this case turned on: beyond a reasonable doubt versus preponderance of the evidence. The criminal jury needed near certainty and did not find it. The civil jury needed only to find it more likely than not. Same defendant, same evidence, 2 opposite results. That gap is the reason Robert Blake was both acquitted of ending Bakley's life and held financially responsible for it. Blake's defense had floated the theory that Christian Brando was involved. Brando had made a recorded phone call in which he threatened Bakley and suggested someone should put a bullet in her. He was never charged in connection with her passing and died in 2008. The theory was never tested. Robert Blake passed away from heart disease at his Los Angeles home on March 9, 2023, at the age of 89. Bonny Lee Bakley's case remains officially unsolved. No one has ever been convicted. 8 names, 8 lives taken, 19 days in jail, 2-year suspended sentences served from another country, acquittals followed by civil liability, and cases closed before a jury ever sat down. The weight of fame sat on every one of these scales. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.